Hey everybody, happy Tuesday. Today we will be talking about an author I really think is changing the way we tell and present stories. That is Celeste Ng.
'Cause I've spent half this morning.
My name is Maya. Welcome to my channel. If you're new, feel free to click the subscribe button. If you're returning, welcome back. So before we really dive into why I find Celeste Ng to be one of the most interesting and powerful voices in contemporary writing, I thought we should establish both who she is and what her body of work looks like so far. Celeste Ng is an American writer and novelist, best known for her novels Little Fires Everywhere, which is now an adaptation, I think it's a TV show, on Hulu, as well as Everything I Never Told You. In 2020, she was the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship. Celeste Ng was born in Pennsylvania. Both of her parents immigrated from Hong Kong to the United States, and her dad was a NASA physicist while her mother was a chemist. Celeste Ng graduated from Harvard with an English degree. I believe she also attended Michigan State for quite some time. Though Ng often returns to her roots in her books, for example, Little Fires Everywhere takes place in Shaker Heights, Ohio, which is where Ng spent much of her childhood, she really refutes the idea of writing what you know. In fact, she says, quote, "Understanding them, other people, is at the root of my fiction. That act of empathy and imagining yourself in someone else's position." Another feature of the majority of Ng's work is her notable lack of hesitancy when it comes to tackling more difficult or complex topics such as race or social class. However, she says it wasn't always this way, and she really had to work on discovering herself as a person and what she believed in order to tackle topics that are very nuanced and apply to a lot of people. It was also really important for her to discuss these things in her writing, as she is a woman of color herself.
One of the characters in the book says that about Shaker Heights. She says, "We don't see race here." And I think it's important to remember that the book was set in the 90s. And what I remember about the 90s when I was a teenager then is that was sort of how you showed your racial awareness. You thought the best thing was to be race blind. And I think now we maybe are starting to realize that there's a downside to that it's more complicated, because if you don't see race, you're essentially saying, I don't notice this big part of your lived experience. I'm going to pretend that the world doesn't treat you differently than it treats me.
She used to be a miniaturist, which means she would sculpt these 1/12th scale model foods for dollhouses and collectors. Additionally, her favorite book is The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. Okay, now that we've established generally who Celeste Ng is as a writer, and maybe a little bit as a person, I want to tell you the 3 key reasons I think she differentiates from other voices in her field, and why I think she will leave such a lasting impact on not only literature, but the way we tell stories. First of all, I call her the NPR of authors. Now, this is debatable because I know that some people don't find NPR to be as balanced as I do, but personally, I think that NPR provides both sides of the political conversation especially rather well. Yes, it does lean more towards the liberal side, towards the progressive side, but conservative voices are still heard. So what does it mean to be the NPR of authors? Well, for me, this means that Ng describes and discusses a lot of difficult topics, and she approaches them from different viewpoints without providing a definitive answer. No one is the villain of their own story, and that's something I think Ng does masterfully with her characters. Everyone thinks they are doing the right thing, and that is why it's so difficult to have a civil conversation, because if you're so convinced that you are right and you're waiting to make your voice heard in the conversation, you're incapable of truly listening to the people on the other side of the aisle. This actually applies very heavily not only to our politics of today, but also just society in general. We have a really difficult time talking about stuff because we refuse to listen. Because Ng is capable of offering both causes and solutions on both sides of an argument, as well as providing a middle ground where you're left with your own interpretation of what is going on, I find her to be an incredibly nuanced writer. She doesn't force anything on you, but she does invite you to think and to ponder and perhaps challenge your previously held notions. Encouraging a reader to think for themselves is perhaps one of the most important things that a writer can do. Yes, it's important to tell a story, But what's the point of a story if we don't think about it and internalize it and discuss its importance in our own lives afterwards? The second reason I'm so excited about Celeste Ng as an author is because I feel she challenges the traditional story arc in a creative and innovative way. So just to give you a general layout of the traditional story arc, it's probably what you learned in about the 7th grade. There's an exposition, there's some rising action, there's a climax, there's falling action, and then there's a resolution. It's a pretty standard, straightforward path for the way a story can be structured, and it's the most common way that stories are structured in terms of the English and literature that are explored in American public schools. However, it is not the only way of telling a story, and arguably it is not the best way by far of telling a story. Celeste Ng is one of those writers that writes her stories and pens her ideas in a way that is much more fluid than the traditional structure. She breaks the rules because she understands them so well, and that makes her work stand out.
The book is incredibly atmospheric and cinematic.
And when you're reading it, you can see it already. I mean, you paint these glorious pictures of both the outside world that they're living in and the time period, but also of their internal lives.
For example, a really noteworthy thing that Celeste Ng incorporates into a lot of her stories, not all, but several, is the idea of having no concrete plot. In her novel, Everything I Never Told You, there is an instigating action, okay? This family has a daughter named Lydia who passes away, and it is ruled as a suicide. So that is the instigating action. That is the spark that starts the fire. But the fire doesn't have any particular trajectory. There's no action that happens after the fire. Instead, it's a slow burn to learn more about characters. She's very good at character study and approaches it in a very empathetic viewpoint. Additionally, in her novel, Little Fires Everywhere, again, nothing really happens. Nothing happens at all. Someone's house is set on fire, and then you learn what built up to that. And what built up to it had very little to do with physical, tangible actions. Instead, it had much more to do with character thought processes and life experiences. Ng's lack of a concrete plot challenges this traditional story arc and tells a story in a really riveting and unique way that I think will ring true to a lot of readers because it reads so personally. It's not mechanical. It's not formulaic. It is genuine and authentic. Apart from being heavily character-driven and not so much impacted by plot, another thing that Celeste Ng does really interestingly in her writing is she often starts with the climax. You often know how a story will end, and I'm a huge fan of telling stories this way. Think of it as deconstructing a math problem. Let's say 3 times 4 is 12. Instead of following that traditional arc, you can come up with the factors that multiplied to be 12 by merely going backwards, by dividing by 4 or by 3. It also provides room for additional answers, right? 6 times 2 is also 12. 12 times 1 is also 12. So when you work backwards, not only does it give you a more comprehensive view of how you can get to that answer in one way, but it can also show you several other ways that the answer can be reached. When we're reviewing something and seeing how it impacted us, it's almost always in hindsight. And in hindsight, we know how it will end. So starting from the ending will often provide a better view of what happened at the beginning because she's able to contextualize not only her characters, their points in life, their experiences, but also tiny little plot points that seem so unimportant that actually have a really powerful part in the story to play. The last reason I think Celeste Ng is one of the best writers of her time so far is because number 3, Concision is Key. Haruki Murakami, I think he is the master of concision. Yes, his books are massive sometimes, but there is rarely a single word or sentence in those books that's unimportant. Everything he says is necessary to understanding a character or a plot point or an experience or an ideology. Murakami doesn't waste his words, and that makes them even more precious because they're clearly delivered with such care. The reader cares to read them more. Ng has a similar approach that I think is honestly more approachable to different people. Murakami's writing I love. I'm a huge fan. But it is wacky, okay? It's not going to be everyone's cup of tea. He loves to blend magical surrealism in with his fiction. Wacky writing isn't for everyone, and Celeste Ng's writing is really palatable to the masses, in my opinion. Though it is that much more palatable than Murakami's writing, it contains the same idea that concision is key. All of her words, all of her sentences, all of her dialogue is so intentional and focused, and that makes it feel so raw and fresh and real. Because Celeste Ng as a writer, and her writing in itself, because they don't pretend to be something that they are not, because they are so raw and fresh in precisely what they are, they're so comfortable in their own states of being, her writing resonates with so many people. To understand Celeste Ng's writing, you merely need to have lived, because living will happen to all of us in different ways. We will all live different trajectories, but those trajectories will often lead us to the same emotions, revelations, and resolutions. In conclusion, I think Celeste Ng is such an exciting writer and one you should definitely check out because one, she is the NPR of writers. She tends to be very objective and explores a lot of ideas without telling her readers exactly what they should or should not be thinking. Number two, Celeste Ng challenges the traditional story arc by focusing on character-driven plots and texts rather than physical, tangible actions that lead to an outcome. It's really exciting because it shows the more humane side of literature. And number three, concision is key, and Celeste Ng is a master of concision. All that said, I really encourage you to check out Ng's writing. If you're not ready to hop straight into a novel right now or invest in a book, totally cool. I'd recommend you head to her website, which will again be linked in the description box, where you can read several of her short stories as well as some of her interviews. Thank you all so much for watching today. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe. I hope you all are well, and I will see you on Thursday.
I know, 'cause I've spent half this morning thinking about the t-shirt you sleep in. I should know, 'cause I'd spend all the whole day listening to your message I'm keeping.